Hi. This lecture is intended to clarify some of the reading that you've done on the cognitive psychology of the emotions, with particular reference to the SPARS model developed by Power and Dalgleish. So, the SPARS model, first of all, is the schematic, propositional, analogical, and associative representational systems. So it's basically a model that talks about four different systems, if you will, that interact in various ways and through their interaction generate the experience of emotion. And it's a theory that brings together a lot of previous cognitive psychological work on emotions, which is why I think it's a useful model for everybody to think about. So first of all, basic question, what is an emotion? You've already done quite a bit of reading about it, so you have a sense of the cognitive psychological take on what an emotion is. But prior to doing your reading, I'm sure that you had your own thoughts about what an emotion might be. So these next slides here, I'm not going to go into too much detail about them, but essentially what I invite you to do is reflect on various words whose meaning is similar to emotion. And you'll note that these are all words you'll see on the next couple of slides: emotion, feeling, mood, disposition, affect. You'll see on the other slide a few other things. They are actually words, for the most part, from popular parlance, words that people use in everyday conversation to talk about these phenomena, the phenomena of emotions and moods, etc., that spectrum of human experience. And psychological science has appropriated those terms in some way and tried to, either through theory or through empirical work, specify a more precise meaning of what those words might be. So in other words, you're talking with your mom or dad or kids about emotions, you'll use that word in the lay sense. But when you are using the word emotion or feeling or any of these words in the context of psychological scientific writing or discourse, conversations even, you have to be very careful because those words in this context, the scientific context, they have a particular technical meaning. And if you are talking to other psychologists, particularly other cognitive psychologists, then you have to be really clear about your technical usage of the words. Now, that being said, different psychological scientists have appropriated the same words to mean slightly different things. So emotion might mean one thing for one emotion researcher and another thing for another emotion researcher. So we know that for Ekman, emotions come in types, and for the people who advocate the dimensional approach, they're not different types of emotions. So there's different specifications. Some researchers put the emphasis on a cognitive appraisal. Other researchers put the emphasis on the physiological response. So and actually, we haven't talked about the behaviorist approach to emotion, but behaviorists would talk about the behavior and emphasize that. So each researcher, for reasons that that researcher thinks are good enough, each researcher might have a slightly different definition of the word emotion. So again, Power and Dalgleish give a good summary, an overview of many of those different views. They don't go so much into, for example, psychoanalytic takes on what emotion is. But aside from that, they give a good overview. And still within Power and Dalgleish, there's leeway. You'll see there's leeway. Sometimes emotions include all of the different possible elements and sometimes just some of them. And the way that word emotion is defined depends not only on the researcher, but also on basically what's going on in the moment, what if there's a specific example that you're talking about. So hope that makes sense. Anyway, just before we get started on all the talk about theories related to emotion, I'd like to invite you to reflect on all of these different words that are in common parlance about emotion. So we have the words like feeling and mood, disposition. On the next slide, you see affect, etc. And I just want to highlight for you, basically these are all just for you to think about. Have a look at the slides and see what you think. What might the difference between emotion and feeling, emotion and mood, emotion and disposition, mood versus disposition, mood versus affect. But what I do want to highlight for you now are two important distinctions. So we have here at the top of this slide emotion versus feeling. And I want to remind you about the Damasio video that you watched, the talk that he gave, where he talks clearly about feeling being basically everything that an emotion is, plus the additional conscious awareness, conscious experience of the emotion. So, in other words, for Damasio, you can have an emotion without having a feeling. You can have an emotion without feeling it, essentially. And sorry if you hear vacuum cleaners going or toilets flushing, etc. I'm at my sister's house, so it's sort of, and there's kids around, so I have the door closed. Hopefully it's not too distracting. I just heard the toilet flush in the other room, but it's not me flushing the toilet. I'm sitting at the desk here. Anyway, and here on this second slide of these contrasts, I also want to highlight for you this difference between mood and affect, and that's particularly important. It's as important as the emotion versus feeling contrast. Here's mood versus affect. That is clinically important because on the mental status exam, when you are asked to describe your client's emotional state, they break it down into mood, which is typically understood by psychiatric psychologists or within psychiatric psychology as referring to the subjective self-report of the client. So in other words, the client would say, I've been feeling down lately. So you would write something like the client reports sad mood. And you would, of course, ask a follow-up question, how long has this been going on? And you'd say 3 weeks. And so you'd say, client reports having had a sad mood for the last 3 weeks. But maybe when he tells that to you, he's actually, maybe it's a relief for him to tell you this. And so maybe he actually seems at peace, or maybe he really likes you, maybe you have a great relationship with him, and he's happy to see you. And so his affect is more tranquil, more euthymic on the spot. So you would say that his affect, which in fact is understood within psychiatric psychology as being what you observe, his affect is incongruent with his reported mood. And that's not necessarily pathological. In this example that I just gave, by the way, there's nothing pathological about that. On the other hand, somebody could say, I've been, very depressed over the last 3 weeks, reporting a sad mood, depressed mood. But when he's telling you this, he could be giddy with almost manic enthusiasm. And this would be another case of incongruent affect and mood, but in this case, it would raise your suspicion, raise your eyebrow somehow, because it seems that there might be something pathological about the incongruence between the affect and the mood. Maybe the person might be psychotic. Person might be, who knows, might be manic, could be full-on psychotic, could be doing some sort of strange malingering. We don't know. But anyway, so we look for congruence between mood and affect. But the idea is within psychiatric psychology that the word affect means what you observe in the person that you're working with, whereas mood is what they report. And by the way, that sometimes boils down to affect being a momentary on-the-spot thing, whereas mood is sort of how the person's been doing over a more extended period of time. That, if you think about it, it'll make sense to you because somebody says, let's say you're there as a client and your therapist asks you, how have you been doing lately? And, maybe everything's fine lately, but you had a really bad day. So you say, I've been doing fine lately. But you might be pissed off when you said it. So the therapist would observe, maybe like a slightly more irritable affect. But as long as you have the ability to be honest and have integrity in your therapy session, then you would still be able to report having been doing relatively well over the past few weeks. And so your self-report, in some cases, will just naturally tend to be make reference to a longer period of time. It's not always the case. The thing to remember is that mood is the self-reported emotional state, and affect is the clinician observed emotional state, or observed by anybody, not just a clinician. But note, like I was saying earlier, different researchers and different lines of application or theory within psychology use these terms in just slightly different ways, because what I just told you is what the definition of affect is within psychiatric psychology. But in fact, in Power and Dalgleish, they don't talk much about affect at all, and the little that they do seems like they might be using it to mean something similar to Damasio's feelings, so something similar to an consciously experienced emotional state. So just to be aware that there are differences in terms of how these terms are used, and when you go to do your own writing about emotions, affects, moods, all these things, just be very clear. And I counsel you again to, when in doubt, add a brief sentence saying exactly what you mean by this technical term. Not only, particularly when you do writing for a class like this, because I want to know that you know what you're talking about. And sometimes if you write in a way that's ambiguous, I won't have enough to go on. But and less so when you do regular professional writing. But sometimes, even in regular professional clinical writing, it's still useful to specify what you mean by the technical term. So anyway, in all of this, I basically just invited you to reflect on technical differences in technical usages of words, and I haven't given you anything concrete to go on. So I'm gonna now turn to Power and Dalgleish, providing a diagram here. This is from chapter 5. And somebody's vacuuming outside, so I hope this doesn't detract from the video at all. But have a look at this, because these are the components of an emotional state, summarized in chapter 5, originally presented in chapter 2. So where is the emotion? in this? Where would you, if you had to draw a circle around the emotion, where would you draw the circle? So you can just reflect on this. Different people might draw the circle around different elements. Here you can certainly see that it would be hard to draw a circle without including in the circle the appraisal. So that seems to be very central. The appraisal, physiological reactivity, and action potential seem to be central parts of it, whereas the event and the behavior on either end, they seem to be less central. But remember that if your approach is like an activity theorist approach, you might actually include the event and the behavior as part of the emotional experience, because remember that for activity theorists, no cognitive event, and by extension no cognitive or affective event, no psychological event, can be understood in isolation. So you'd have to include all of the life events, contextual circumstances, etc., as well as the behavioral products. So it depends on what you like, essentially, where you draw that circle. But the recommendation in Power and Dalgleish is that the appraisal, you can see on this chain, the appraisal needs to be included, because it's the only way, they say, to clearly differentiate between emotions. And you can think of an easy example of this by, for example, thinking about, you get, say, like, maybe there's somebody apologizes to another person, but two people apologize to somebody else, and so the behavior is the same, but maybe one is doing it to reduce their own guilt, whereas the other is doing it because of genuine emotional resonance with the suffering of the other person. So behavior certainly isn't a way to tell the difference between emotions. Physiological response. For example, me, I tend to be sort of high-strung sometimes. So if something freaks me out, I get very, very physiologically activated. And actually, even when it's just a little thing, I can still get sort of physiologically activated. I can still get like a little bit of that tachycardia and shortness of breath and this sort of thing. I'm working on it, But so, I might have, low-level sympathetic activation in response to just a low-level emotion, whereas the next person over might only get that physical response for a much more intense version of the same emotion. So because there are differences from individual to individual in terms of how physiologically responsive we are to emotions, we also can't differentiate one emotion from the other on the basis of physiological response. Action readiness, obviously that's sort of covered by behavior. And obviously conscious awareness is no way to tell emotions the one from the other, because we might not even have conscious awareness. We know that from Damasio and also from Power and Dalgleish. So that's why in this model the appraisal is central. And appraisal is central even when emotion is generated through the associative pathway, by the way, as you'll see later. So anyway, what is an emotion? It is at least an appraisal, a physiological response, and an action readiness. And then there are a couple other options, add-ons. You might have these various add-ons like plugins or whatever, if you like. And yet, so we can say that the emotion is a complex chain of events. An appraisal, a response, an action readiness. And again, you can differ like which you think comes first, the response first, the appraisal first, etc. You'll see there's been theoretical debate. You're already aware of that, actually. But a complex chain of events triggered by certain stimuli. So that means that there's causality within this, and it's also sequential in some way. Something happens first, like an emotionally competent event, which is Damasio's term. An emotionally competent event happens, and then it is experienced, it's perceived, Um, and then a chain reaction essentially is started, and there's recursiveness within the chain reaction, so that later events in the chain can actually go back and modify earlier processes, so that as time passes, essentially the emotion might change, it might escalate, it might reduce itself, that sort of thing. So, but nonetheless, even though emotion is a complex chain of heterogeneous mental phenomena, it is nonetheless experienced as a whole thing. People experience sadness, and it feels like an emergent whole. So that's just something to keep in mind, that in some ways, as we're going to be talking about, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So, one example is, that the appraisal. If you think that the appraisal leads to a physiological response in action readiness, and then that whole conglomerate of heterogeneous experiences, appraisal, response, and readiness, that is then experienced as a whole, then as a whole it can later influence subsequent appraisals. So if you start to get, in other words, if something bad happens, a goal is lost, and you get sad, and you have the physiological response of deactivation and action readiness to withdraw, this sort of thing, then that in aggregate can bias the system overall. There's a sadness module going, so that subsequent appraisals are biased in a sadness word direction. So, and in that sense, the emotion functions as a whole. Now, that's sort of a foretaste of what's going to come, but back to what is an emotion. Just a couple slides here on categorical versus dimensional approaches to emotion. I think we've talked already about categorical versus dimensional distinctions between phenomena, and a categorical approach to understanding the phenomena in the natural world would be an approach that says that the phenomena under consideration differ, each one from the others, qualitatively rather than quantitatively. So they differ by type rather than differ by degree. That means a categorical approach is a sort of apples and oranges approach, whereas a dimensional approach would be the idea that there's no such thing as tall people or short people, because there's no group of tall people, group of short people, because there's all these people in the middle, and it doesn't make sense to say that some people are tall or some people are short, because it would be arbitrary in a way. Hopefully that makes sense. But anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So anyway, back to the apples and oranges approach, categorical approach. This primarily comes from the work of Paul Ekman and people who followed him. But basically, he did work on facial expressions, emotionally relevant facial expressions, and did a lot of huge, actually, cross-cultural studies, and in various different countries, and found pretty much universally that there are just a handful of basic emotional types, each one with its own discernible, identifiable facial expression that differs by type from the facial expressions pertaining to the other emotions in that handful of basic emotions. So Ekman's original six were happiness, surprise, anger, sadness, fear, and disgust. You'll note that in Parr and Dalgleish, which adopt the categorical approach as well, surprise is not present. So that should illustrate for you an ongoing principle of the course, which is that there's never perfect agreement. So you can think about the categorical approach to emotions as pointing towards, say between 5 and 7 types of basic emotions, each one with their own facial expression, and there's a good deal of empirical research backing that up. And if you want to subdivide the emotions further, then you'd find, could find 25, 30, etc., different types within, if you look at subtypes. But just looking at the basic types, say 5 to 7. So this work has been going on for the last 40 years. It's very convincing, but there's not perfect agreement even among the researchers that share this view. Now, contrastingly, we have the dimensional approach to emotion. And in this, again, it's sort of like the idea that different from the categorical approach to emotion, it's the idea that you could construct a 2 or more dimensional space with 2 or more different axes, each axis pertaining to a particular variable that is necessary to specify any particular instance of an emotional experience. So the simplest type of dimensional approach, well, the simplest type would be a one-dimensional approach, like say just pleasure to misery. And you might say, if you believed in a one-dimensional approach to emotion, you could say that every emotion could be specified on a single dimension, going from infinitely pleasurable to infinitely miserable, going through a 0 point, which would be equally pleasurable or miserable, or maybe, something like this. So that would get you into problems, though, because somebody could say, well, say I'm equally afraid and angry. Or so one person is, say there are 2 experiences, fear, a level 10 fear, and a level 10 anger would show up as level 10 misery. And there would be no way in that one-dimensional model of emotion to differentiate between fear and anger. So that doesn't really make very much sense. That's how it works, but that doesn't make very much sense. So you need a more complicated dimensional model than just a simple one-dimensional model. So the next simplest would be, of course, a 2-dimensional model. You can just think of it as an x and a y axis. Actually, the next slide shows that. So I'm just previewing it for you. But you might have a prominent example of a 2-dimensional model of emotion is valence versus arousal. So valence would be that pleasure to misery one, how subjectively aversive the emotional experience is. And arousal could be, maybe, if that's the x-axis, then arousal could be the y-axis. And it could be basically a measure of how activated the emotional experience is. So now it's starting to bring in that physiological response portion. So you could think of the arousal dimension as being going from infinitely aroused, or as aroused as humanly possible, as activated as humanly possible, to as somnolent, as deactivated as humanly possible, which might be sleep. So just thinking about it, I'm going to advance the next slide, but just thinking about it, so look at that arousal to sleep dimension. If and say it goes from like +10 to -10, with -10 being sleep. So 0 would be right there in the middle, and say you're a 5. First I'm a 5 on arousal, and then I go to a 6 because things are getting ratcheted up a little bit. But then if I'm comparing that experience at 5 and at 6 with each other, I would always be able to find a midpoint in between them. I could be 5.5, and then between 5.5 and 5, I could refine it to 5.25, and between 5 and 5.25, between 5.25 and 5, I could specify it further to 5.125. And between 5.125 and 5, I could find 5.07, right? Something in the middle. I could keep finding midpoints. And so, if I was going to say something like, for example, if fear and sadness are both on the misery side of the model, but fear is, because it involves anxiety, it's more highly aroused, whereas sadness is is a lower level of arousal. Then I would say you could probably, maybe there's a way of going from fear to sadness by simply decreasing your level of arousal. And along that trajectory, I would always be able to find a midpoint between any 2 points on that trajectory. And this is different from a qualitative distinction between fear and sadness. So in the Ekman up here, in the Ekman et al. Approach, which indicates qualitative distinctions between emotions, you wouldn't be able to simply find a midpoint between fear and sadness. It wouldn't make sense because there is something qualitatively distinct about each of those 2 emotions. Whereas in the two-dimensional, or in any dimensional model of emotion, you would always be able to gradually increase some variable that pertains to that emotional experience, and by modifying it gradually, eventually get to the point where it's quite a different emotional experience. But that even very, very different emotional experiences that are experienced subjectively as being very different from each other, are somehow connected along a gradient. So those are the 2 primary approaches to emotion. And again, we're using the Power and Dalgleish text, so we're going with the qualitative distinctions. But there is some talk in Power and Dalgleish of the dimensional model. So I would say let's go with the qualitative model, but keep in mind that it doesn't have perfect explanatory power, because it has certainly been criticized for oversimplifying the differences between emotions. And so, for example, if we imagined a multidimensional space with many, many dimensions, maybe 20 different dimensions, not just 2, and each emotional experience, every emotional experience imaginable, could be characterized by those 20 variables: pleasure to misery, and activated to deactivated, and whatever it is. Maybe we wouldn't even have words in the English language for all of those 20 different variables, and each variable would be a dimension describing the multidimensional space. And then you would choose a point in that multidimensional space that would perfectly describe the emotional experience under consideration. That the dimensional theorists, they say that this gives a lot more flexibility and refinement to science's ability to describe emotional experience, compared to a categorical approach, which they see as glossing over important fine-tuning sorts of distinctions. Now, hopefully you're thoroughly confused by that, thinking once again that this class doesn't tell you anything is the way anything is. So that's good, because again, to reiterate to you, my ulterior motive is to show you that all of science involves models, and every model is simply an utterance, and every utterance is both exuberant and deficient. It conveys more than we want for it to convey, and it also fails to convey many of the things that we hoped that it would convey. So every model is both exuberant and deficient. So both of these are wrong, but both are useful in a certain way as well. Anyhow, speaking of usefulness, why do we even have emotions? So generally, the way I like to think about things is that whether you're into full-on natural selection based on random occurrences of genetic mutations and environmental constraints, or whether you're into intelligent design, either way, we must have emotions for some reason. They have to be useful in some way. If we didn't need them, then why would we have them? So what is the point of emotions? Why are they useful? And from a cognitive psychological perspective, if you can sort of pare this question down and answer it in a very concrete way, that emotions usually help us with certain kinds of decision making. So here are some examples. Fear leads to selective attention to threat and might cause that action readiness, which would be readiness to either fight or fly away. Flee, not fly. Fly, it's gonna maybe to either fight or flee. And so you can see that fear, by doing this under normal circumstances, would help in any organism avoid dangerous situations and lower, in general, across the population, lower the accidental death rate, this sort of thing. And likewise, sadness increases focus on accurate analysis of problems, and I've misspelled the word strategic, but might help people know when to withdraw. Sometimes getting a solution to our problems requires withdrawing or submitting to authority, or accepting some difficult thing that has occurred. And so in this way, sadness can actually, might lead to an increase in social support, and particularly improve the extent to which an individual would be able to find an adaptive place within a hierarchy. So these are times when emotions are helpful, and actually that's most of the time. Most of the time emotions can be helpful. And as we'll see, so that's like the ordered version of emotion, the emotion that reflects what's really going on in the environment and leads to flexible changes in cognitive acts. Now, let's talk about some of the earliest psychological theories of emotion. The first major theory was the James Lange theory, and it's probably actually pronounced Lange, I guess. I've never looked that up, but he was Danish, Carl Lange. But in any event, William James, my hero, personal hero, and Carl Lange, who I have no idea who he is, except for I know that he had the same theory as William James, both developed the same idea independently of each other. That's why it's called the James Lange theory. In the mid-1880s, end of the 19th century. And so they talked about 3 successive stages in emotion generation: an emotionally competent stimulus, an event, and I'm using Damasio's term there. They didn't call it an emotionally competent stimulus, but it's a nice term. You could use it. So there's an event, like a car coming rapidly towards you as you cross the road. And then the next thing that happens is a physiological change, or more than one, maybe. So arousal in the autonomic nervous system. And then there is potentially a subjective interpretation of the bodily changes, which leads to the experience of emotion, which would be akin to Damasio's consciously experienced feeling. So you can see that here visually. There's the perception of the event. There's the event, actually, and then there's the perception of the event. And then there is the bodily changes. And note here that, and particularly for James, talking about these earlier theories, James included the running away. I think on this other slide, it just mentions physiological changes, but in fact for James, the bodily changes involved behavior too. So you see the bear coming, and then you find yourself running away with your heart beating and being short of breath, and then you interpret all of those bodily and behavioral changes in some way, and that interpretation is what constitutes, in fact, the experience of the emotion. So you can think of this as like precursor to a cognitive appraisal model. There's an interpretation going on, but really it's more like event and physiological change plus behavior. So later, quite a bit later, in 1962, variant of this is the Schachter and Singer theory. This is actually an interesting experiment. I'm not going to go over it right now. For example, you ought to know it for the EPPP, that sort of thing. But what they came out with was that two factors are essential for emotions to be experienced. You need some change in physiological arousal. I would actually not necessarily call it high physiological arousal, because sometimes it can be low. I'm gonna have to edit that slide later. It could be a change in physiological arousal, and then an emotional interpretation of the change in that arousal. And so no emotion will be experienced if either is missing. So actually, to tell you the truth, when Schachter and Singer did it, they were really only talking about high arousal, because they gave adrenaline shots, I think, actually, and induced emotions. But for our purposes, you can clearly see how this idea would extend to abnormally low levels of physiological arousal as well. Now, moving on to the 80s and 90s, we get into the earliest appraisal theories. So this is where psychology starts to come out really clearly and start to say that emotional experience really depends on cognitive appraisal, the interpretation of the current situation. It's not just any interpretation, but a particular type of interpretation. And what type of interpretation is it? You can think about this Lazarus's view of cognitive appraisal as being subdivided into three types. There's primary appraisal, secondary appraisal, and a reappraisal. So the first one, primary appraisal, is whether it is a positive event in relationship to your well-being, irrelevant to your well-being, or stressful because it impedes your well-being in some way. And then the secondary appraisal is that same situation that you just did the primary appraisal on, you do another appraisal, which is you take stock of the whole thing in light of your interpretation of your own coping resources that are relevant to help you deal with this situation. And then there's a reappraisal, because time is going by, right? So the situation is changing and you're taking action, etc. And so the stimulus situation and coping strategies continue to be modified. And then this changes your primary and secondary appraisals on an ongoing basis. So it's never just a snapshot. It's always an ongoing thing. Now, a refinement of this, you see here also from Lazarus, Smith and Lazarus in the early 90s, subdivided those three types of appraisal into actually 6 components. Each one has 2 parts to it. So the primary appraisal has motivational relevance and motivational congruence. Secondary appraisal is divided into accountability and problem-focused coping potential. So, excuse me, I'm misspeaking. Actually, the secondary is divided into 4 parts. So the primary appraisal, let me back up so I don't confuse you guys more than I already did. But essentially, this distinction between motivational relevance and motivational congruence still falls within the primary appraisal because it has to do with how, have I committed myself? How relevant is this situation for me? And if it's highly relevant, then I'm more motivated by this experience. So the experience will be more motivating for me. And how tied in with it, how tied in to my personal goals is this experience that I'm passing through? Is it congruent or incongruent? And so the more relevant and congruent you appraise the present situation to be, the more motivating it will be for you. So the secondary appraisals divided into 4 subtypes, focusing on accountability, problem-focused coping potential, emotion-focused coping potential, and future expectancy is also important. So you're going to see later that some types of emotion are focused on a particular person. So there's this appraisal of who deserves the credit or blame for the situation that you're in. So, for example, it's hard to be angry if without having somebody to blame. Even if a lot of times people blame God, or blame the universe, or blame themselves, or blame another person, maybe scapegoating another person. So there's a secondary appraisal which can be valid or invalid or whatever. It just happens to be, whether it's valid or invalid, it's important. So I might think that, I'm the one to blame for a particular situation, when really, who knows? Maybe it just was the way things worked out. But so I do a secondary appraisal that involves a determination of who's accountable. And then these 2 types of coping, problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping, have to do with the problem-focused coping is resolving the situation, and emotion-focused coping is handling it psychologically. So, in other words, if the situation can't be resolved, how can I stay balanced psychologically? Do I need to avoid thinking about it, or do I need to sublimate something, or do I, what is it? And so a lot of defenses actually come in here, psychological defenses. And then that last type of secondary appraisal, or component of secondary appraisal, I guess, is future expectancy. How likely is it that the situation will change? And that refers also to, if you're going to do problem-focused coping, then how likely is it that your problem-focused coping will be effective? But it doesn't only have to do with problem-focused coping, because maybe the situation itself is malleable or temporary. If the situation is seen as permanent, then it might motivate you in a different way. If the situation is seen as permanent and not malleable in response to problem-focused coping, then it might be actually very disheartening for you. But if the situation is permanent, but with a good chance that your problem-focused coping might actually resolve it completely, permanent if you do nothing, but responsive to problem-focused coping, then that actually might be very invigorating for you. So you can see how these appraisals work together to determine how a person experiences a particular emotion, or a particular situation. So this appraisal theory was developed in the context of Lazarus's view of coping. And it's the way situations are appraised in relationship to the view of self, world, and other, and personal goals. So again, the different emotional states can be distinguished on the basis of the appraisal components. Now, these earlier appraisal theories didn't say much about the actual processes involved in appraisal. You can see if you look back here, it just sort of says what the appraisal is targeting. But it doesn't say how that's happening cognitively, the process. Remember that. So in other words, here it's sort of talking about content. In other words, it might be more akin to representation within Neisser's cognitive architecture, whereas here it's talking about process. So these later theories, for example, Smith and Kirby, 2001, started to distinguish between two different types of appraisal processes. A more reasoned process, what they called reasoning, versus a more automatic process, which they call associative processing. You can see this harks to back to what's called to Kahneman's System 1 and System 2, right? So System 1 would be the associative processing, and System 2 would be the reasoning. And again, the reasoning, just like System 2, it takes more time, it requires attentional resources, it's more deliberate, it is not automatic, it is controlled, whereas that associative processing occurs quickly, rapidly, automatically, and it's sort of without a lot of personal control, because it just activates all relevant information in long-term memory, even information that might not be particularly adaptive for you to be for it to be activated. For example, in the case of PTSD, it's that associative processing that causes the highly stressed out reaction to become salient, even when it's just a car alarm going off in the road. It's not an air raid warning. So then there is another function within this Smith and Kirby theory where there are appraisal detectors that monitor information about the type of appraisal that's going on from both the reasoning and the associative processes, and feed that information about the appraisal back into the overall information processing system, and then that appraisal information is what determines the emotional experience. And so this fits very nicely actually with the Power and Dalgleish perspective that the central element of the emotion is the cognitive appraisal, and that is through examining the cognitive appraisal that we can determine one emotion from another. And so this is actually giving us a model for how that might actually work from the inside out. On this one, other problems with early appraisal theories. Up here on this slide, it's pointed out that until recently there hasn't been much of a focus on the actual cognitive processes. And then further problems with the earlier appraisal theories is that they may simplify this appraisal and experience of emotion. The idea that there's only 3 types of appraisal that can be basically divided into 6 components, 2 components of primary appraisal and 4 components of secondary appraisal, plus this idea that there's a reappraisal going on continuously. That actually might simplify appraisal. There might be finer distinctions between types of appraisal. Maybe appraisals don't differ one from the other by type, just in the way that emotions themselves might not differ the one from the other by type. So this is the same type of criticism here levied against the appraisal theories of emotion generation, but it's the same type of criticism that we saw earlier, just a few slides up, on the people who like the dimensional approaches to emotion, the types of criticisms that they were levying against the categorical approaches to emotion, essentially saying that those theories oversimplify processes that are much more variegated. And obviously we haven't seen anything yet about social context or cultural context. And in fact, we've seen Ekman's claim that certain emotions are universal. But is that really the case? Just because somebody has the same facial expression and does the same behavior, is that the same emotion? It's not clear that it is, actually. You could take an emic approach and say that we don't know yet. We need to do phenomenological research. Actually, this would be a good dissertation project. Anyhow, and these early appraisal theories leave a lot of open questions. They don't say anything about what emotion is, if it's physiological or cognitive. They tend to place more emphasis on cognition, but these James Longa theory, Damasio, the whole field of affective neuroscience certainly suggest otherwise, and um, they they don't necessarily take on these other approaches. These appraisal theories don't take on these other competing approaches to say where the other competing approaches fall short. So what we're left with is we have a bunch of different approaches, and we don't know exactly which is going to be most fruitful. So we're going to learn some of these theories and then work on combining them so that as we move forward, we can choose the ones that we like the best on the basis of what we perceive to be better explanatory power for the questions that we're asking. So, and then there's also that question of, can an emotion occur without awareness? Appraisal theories, or particularly the early appraisal theories, seem to suggest that emotions do always occur with awareness. But of course, later conceptualizations of emotion, like Damasio, it suggests otherwise. You can have emotions, but not all emotions produce feelings. And then Levant from Harvard, who was here a couple years ago, I was on a panel with him about normative male alexithymia, which is the idea that alexithymia, in fact, is a condition where you don't know what feeling it is that you're feeling. You don't know what it is. You can't tell. And Levant's research has suggested that for many males, that's actually normal. It's normal for males not to know what they're feeling. All right, so now moving onward to the multi-level SPARS approach. We're going to go more into it later, but here just a taste. This, again, recapping that it is this schematic, propositional, associative, and analogical representational systems. Now I don't even know which A is which. I like it better with the analogical as the first A, but I don't care which way you put it. The thing that to remember is that one of the A's is analogical and the other A is associative. Basically, just to recap what we've gone over before, an analogical representation system is the mental representation system for sensory data. And you can think of like the sensory register and even any sensory data that is stored in long-term memory, including mental images. Thinking about that Koslin and Pomerantz article and the whole Koslin versus Pilischin debate. And whereas the propositional representational system would be a system by which propositional representations, or in other words, little chunks of information stored in memory that don't pertain to sense data but do pertain to basic chunks of meaning. So that's the propositional representation system. And then the schematic system would be higher order organizations of propositions and also possibly analogs. Typically, we think of schemas as being higher order organizations of propositions into interpretable, goal-relevant mental models. They're not always schemas, by the way, are not always goal-relevant, but the schemas that are relevant to emotions, those tend to be goal-relevant, because remember that a cognitive appraisal that leads to an emotion is always assessing the current situation or the target situation in relation to some schematic representation of a life goal for the person, either a momentary goal or a life goal, some sort of personally relevant goal. So in Power and Dalglish, they talk about different systems, that the analogical representations would all be organized into one system, the propositional representations in another system, the schemas into another system, etc. I'm not so clear on why these would need to be distinct systems, but maybe it's helpful for our understanding to think about them as separate. and I don't think we lose much if we do. But this could be another case where an utterance is exuberant. So they have said that that these are separate systems. In some way, they've implied that they're separate systems, and that could be an exuberance of the utterance, which is causing us to almost overinterpret what's going on, possibly. And then there's the associative system, which is basically, it contains analogs and propositions. In other words, analogical representations and propositional representations, and they are tied together with logical links. And as activation spreads through the system, then it yields automatically elicited emotions. So you can see one diagram that looks like it describes the Sparse approach pretty well. Take a look at that. So you can see that the only two pieces that feed into emotions are the schematic system, which is the appraisals, and the associative system, which is the automatic generation of emotion. And the analogs and the propositions, they are the backbone on which the schematic system and the associative system work. And the only thing that I don't like about this particular drawing, now that I look at it, I'm talking about it, as I look at it, there should be an arrow from the analogical system to the associative system, because there are obviously analogs. I'm going to give you an example of that in a minute. There are obviously analogs in the associative system. Of course there are. So just think about that, an arrow going from, like a two-headed arrow, between the analogical system and the associative system. So this is actually just again, for your reflection, it echoes what I said before. If all this is going on to produce an emotion, it seems like we would have a disjointed experience of emotion, and yet we experience an emotion as a whole. It's like a heterogeneously defined yet whole packet. So just keep that in mind as you go through. How might that be? I don't have an answer to that necessarily. Now, here are the two pathways to the generation of emotion. You see here that there's a Route 1 and Route 2. Route 1 is the appraisal-based route. It's more effortful, slower. And Route 2 is the associative route. It's a little unfortunate here. Obviously, Power and Dalgleish, their Route 1 basically is reminiscent of Kahneman's System 2. I'm not saying, now don't maybe it's helpful actually that Route 1, that it's not the other way around, because it might lead us to erroneously draw too many comparisons between Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 and Power and Dalgleish Route 1 and Route 2. They're not necessarily the same thing, but I do want you to notice this thing, that there's a more effortful route and there's a less effortful route that's more automatic. And you could see here that the event happens, it's time flowing from left to right. So the event happens earliest and then it gets represented analogically. We know that from the first part of the term, because what happens, it comes in through the sensation system, sensory system, and it gets represented in the sensory register. And then, of course, attention happens, and then as some of it passes through attention, some of it gets filtered out, and some of it lands in working memory, and then from there some of it goes into long-term memory. So we know that this is happening at the same time, but in terms of just the generation of emotion, first there is an analog. So maybe the bear is running towards me, and so the first thing is that I see the bear, and I have the mental image of the bear, and the noise of the bear, and all those mental images that are represented analogically. That's the very first thing that happens. And then there is a low-level interpretation of those analogs. And I create propositions that are relevant, like bear, running towards me, this sort of thing. And then those propositions get organized at successively higher and higher levels of organization to form schemas, like the bear is running at me and wants to eat me, the bear is chasing me and is going to eat me and kill me, and so then when I have that schema that the bear is chasing me and wants to eat me and kill me, then at that level I can compare that schema to some other schema that I have in my long-term memory that describes a life, a personally relevant goal. Like in this case, it might be staying alive. So I see that the schematic interpretation I have generated on the basis of what's going on, that is inhibitory towards my personal goal. It's very relevant and but it's incongruent. It's relevant, but it's incongruent. In other words, the primary appraisal there has motivational relevance and motivational incongruence. So that's how I would think about relevance and congruence, actually. And then and then there's probably other things going on too, like there's a large thing coming towards me quickly, making a lot of noise. And there is an evolutionarily established associative pathway to the generation of fear. So when something large is coming at you, whether it's a car or a bear, you're going to get scared and run away. That has been evolutionarily adaptive. I don't even have to go through the appraisal process. So that's why James is saying, I find myself running away and then I experience the emotion. So certainly the appraisal comes later than the association. And in this case, the associative pathway and the appraisal pathway would both take us in the direction of the same emotion. It's not always the case. Now, I just wanted to say again that this idea that there is an associative pathway to the generation of emotion and an appraisal-based pathway to the generation of emotion, it seems to imply that the appraisal pathway doesn't work through association. So I just want to clarify that there is a connectionist neural net substratum underlying all of cognition, all emotional experience. I mean, basically, like I've said before, in the head, it's all ones and zeros. At the bottom line, it's all ones and zeros. And so all thinking and all psychological experience relies on those ones and zeros. So certainly, clearly, the associative pathway relies on ones and zeros, certain nodes activated, other nodes not activated, activation spreading through nodes that are more closely linked to each other. But even the appraisal, which is a higher level thing that's going on, that also couldn't take place without all of those ones and zeros firing every few microseconds. So, don't be confused by Power and Dalglish's use of the word associative as implying that there's no associative network underlying the appraisal pathway. It's just the very basic ones and zeros sort of thing. It underlies all psychological experience. Now, just to situate this whole thing within the context of the course, think back to early Neisser when he talked about the architecture of mind, had those three components: structure, representation, and process. And that's essentially what we're seeing here: structure, representation, and process. There is structure, organization of information into schemas. The content of that has to be personally relevant, goal relevant, self, world, and other. And then there's a certain process by which those appraisals are made. And the same thing for Route 2. There's a structure of information in long-term memory, the logical links that are there. The nodes themselves are the representations, and the process is the spreading activation that takes you through that pathway to the generation of emotion. And so that's essentially, SPARS is essentially an information processing model of emotion generation. It talks about structure, representation, and process. And so these these ideas that we saw earlier in the term, like in social cognition, where there was distributed cognition, or the extended mind, or activity theory, where no cognition can be understood in extracted completely from its context. It doesn't make sense to extract cognition from the context of the life goal in which it is triggered. That those theories actually they're in some ways more radical. They're more radical than what we see in Power and Dalgleish. And remember when I was saying on an earlier slide that depending on where you circled, where would you circle where the emotion is? Remember it was this one. Where is it? Boy, it's way up there. Yeah, here. I said, where would you draw the circle around the emotion? And I gave as an example, depends on your theoretical viewpoint. If you're an information processing person, then you would draw your circle, you'd at least have the appraisal, physiological reactivity, and action potential circled within the circle. If you might extend it to interpretation, and I suppose you could extend it to behavior. It all depends on your preferences. But you probably wouldn't have the event in it. But definitely, if you are an activity theorist thinking about emotion, you would have to draw the circle around the entire diagram here, because what happens inside the head would be uninterpretable without contextualizing it in terms of its event, the life events, and that the antecedent life events and the concomitant life events, and then the behavior that's generated, because no psychological experience is understandable in this illusory extraction from its context. So anyway. I think I was here. Yeah, so in some ways, Hurst and the activity theorists are more radical than Power and Dalgleish. Just keep that in mind. But you can still remember, it's never about throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's take what you can, see where it has explanatory power, and then keep working, keep refining your understanding. And also you get to figure out what you like. What are your preferences? What types of explanations do you like, and why? So next series of slides are going to take you through different routes through this model. So the first thing is, and I think I've talked about this already, but so the first thing that happens is there's an event outside. Damasio would call it an emotionally competent event. And then it gets represented analogically. I see the bear running towards me, and I form a mental image of the bear. And this goes in the sensory register. Obviously, I say here, reflect on this. That's the first thing that happens. So everything, the loud noises, the soft caresses, whatever it is, they all get represented analogically. Then, and then this interpretation. Remember, the first thing that's going to happen is an interpretation. So the situation has to be interpreted. So we have the event being first represented analogically, and then low-level translations of the analogical representations into basic small chunks of meaning, i.e. propositions, takes place. So you go, the analogs stimulate the creation of propositions, or the activation of relevant propositions, and then those propositions get organized into increasingly complex, higher order organizations, and then we call them a schema. And the schemas are interpretable. And not all schemas are goal relevant, but the ones that we're talking about here, they are goal relevant. Now, just to review again, an analog is a mental representation of sensory information. It's not independently meaningful. So careful with this, because an analogical representation of a soft caress when I say that soft caress isn't independently meaningful, I mean that it doesn't have propositional meaning. It might have relevance. It might be important. So sometimes when here's something I just thought of. A lot of times in common parlance, we conflate the word meaningful with the word important. So the analogical representation of the soft caress might not be meaningful in the sense of a proposition, but it is definitely important. For sure, it's calming. It could trigger, you know, a, a de-escalation of a negative emotional experience, this sort of thing. So uh, then propositions are, contrastingly, are mental representations of a basic meaning unit. So they are based on the processing of analogs. So you can't, the propositions are basically already there in your long-term memory, and they just are activated according to whatever experience you're going through. And the analogs themselves are what stimulates the activation of certain propositions. So first I have to see the bear has to come at me. Then I have to sense the bear and perceive and create analogical representations. And then it's those analogical representations that allow me to activate the relevant propositions. There is a bear, these low level, that bear is running, the direction is towards me, those sorts of things. And then you can see how all those things, there is a bear, the bear is running, the direction is towards me, all those low-level propositions, they get combined together. And it becomes an interpretable mental representation and personalized organization of this new information combined with past experiences. So that's when I realized that this big animal is actually a bear. So so figure out that's a hungry bear. I know that when bears run towards me, that's when they're hungry. So that now I know in my schema, at the level of propositions, I might not have known it was a hungry bear, but at schema, because I'm combining it with past information, I know, or I think I know, I've interpreted that that's a hungry bear running towards me who's going to run towards me until he gets me. Oh, I've known that it's then at that level, I know it's a grizzly bear, and I know that he's hungry, and I know that they don't give up until they tear you limb from limb. Or, I don't know, whatever it is. I could have learned wrong information or right information, but it's whatever is there in my long-term memory gets combined with the new information to form an interpretable schema. And obviously, it's active and evolving. So if the bear does something unexpected, if the bear, I don't know, starts doing like a choreographed circus dance, then I realize that it's a circus bear, and it's not going to eat me, and I have to change my schema. And so how is it that this new information that's coming in actually interacts with the old information? The idea is that the propositions, the analogs, and the schemas, they stimulate searching and matching strategies where there's some new analogical representation, and there's a search and match strategy for similar analogical representations from past knowledge, either stuff I've read or stuff I've experienced. And when I find the analog that matches the old analog in my long-term memory that matches close enough the new analog, I found it through that search through the long-term memory and matching. And when that match is made, then it's like, yeah, that's when I can identify that this big hairy animal running towards me is a bear. So, and this happens on all levels. It happens at the levels of analogical representations, of propositional representations, and schematic representations. And the more this happens, say like I go out every day for a year, and every single day a bear chases me, and so at that point, my through the process of mental plasticity, which is based on neurological plasticity, there are structural changes actually that are brought on. So I start to get very familiar with all of the information relevant to bear, and I start to expect bears to run after me, and I would be surprised when I don't see a bear running after me, all this sort of thing. So, and that this becomes actually encoded, not encoded, the better word would be built in. It's built in to my information processing architecture. This familiarity with bears, this expectancy of bears, simply because I've experienced it so often. So to think about these different pathways to the generation of emotion within SPARS, you might use the metaphor high to low. And for this, we are indebted to George Lakoff, a very, very cool linguist and philosopher, and actually he does very interesting political commentary too, if you're interested. But anyhow, he talks about this metaphor high versus low, and here we are looking at more complex forms of organization as being higher and more useful in some ways, versus low. What's low would be less complex and sometimes less useful. So certainly between schemas and propositions, we can see that the schemas are more complex and the propositions are less complex. Schemas are high, propositions are low, and analogs would be even lower. They're less, perhaps, and it's sort of debatable, because Koslin might say that, certainly Polishin would say that the analogical representation is slightly more complex than the propositional substratum that Polishin was saying underlies the experience of mental images. But again, there's people saying one thing or another, and so you get to basically just think about it how you like, in a way, with reference to the literature. But schemas are high in complexity, whereas propositions and analogs are lower. And appraisal thereby used higher pathways of information processing, more effortful and time-consuming. And you can ask yourself, is that always the case? Whereas associative system would use lower pathways of information processing. It's automatic, quicker, less complex. And again, you could ask yourself, is that always the case? But this is the idea. And then remember that SPARS is a bringing together of these different accounts of the generation of emotion. And think back, the other people, the people who, like Lazarus, for example, and Lyons, who also did appraisal, and then look at like Mandler, for example, or people who did the associative only theories of the generation of emotion. Each of those theorists thought that their theory was sufficient to explain emotion. So now Parr and Dalgleish are saying, no, neither appraisal by itself nor associative by itself is enough, because both are happening and both explain different kinds of emotional phenomena. So you get to critique that in your own mind. It might not be the case. Maybe Parr and Dalgleish are missing something. Maybe there's a way in which associative models actually are able to explain everything, and that we don't need to rely on appraisal models, or vice versa. And you can always, as we go through this, at what level does therapy work? Level or levels, does therapy work to change existing patterns of emotion generation? And it could be maybe different kinds of therapies work at different levels. This would be a very important thing for you to consider. What types of therapies aim to influence Route 1, i.e. the appraisal route? And what types of therapies aim to influence Route 2, i.e. the associative route? Now, going back to that, that diagram that we saw before with the Route 1 and the Route 2 on it, I actually think I talked about this slide already, so you can see it now. But basically, if a bear is running towards you, your eyes and ears take it in, and then it's processed in perceptual areas of the brain, and then mental images and which would include auditory analogs or olfactory analogs. Maybe smell that bear. Who knows? I don't know what bear smells like. You smell the bear smell, and then that smell is represented as an olfactory analog within your information processing system. And so all these mental representations are analogical representations of the external event. Now, these events are not always external, because remember, in the Schechter and Singer experiment, there were injections of adrenaline, and that caused an internal event. And so there's an increase in autonomic arousal from the injection of adrenaline. There's tachycardia and shortness of breath, for example, and tightness in the belly. And those, you might actually consider those events to also be external, in the sense that they're external to your representational system. They're things that you could notice. So even though they're inside your body, but you're noticing them just as much as you might notice, this big hairy thing running towards you. You might notice that you're short of breath. So you could form a mental image of a proprioceptive analog. Actually, you might call it a proprioceptive analog. Or if you get nauseous from the bear smell, you might, who knows, if you get nauseous from the bear smell, you might have a vestibular analog, that you have a mental analogical representation of that feeling of being off balance that you get from being nauseous from the smell of the bear, etc. So this question of this use of the word external is for your further reflection, but that's how I think of it. Now, so then, and I've actually alluded to this before. I don't know how much more detail I need to go into, but so a low-level chunk of meaning, or various low-level chunks of meaning, are formed on the basis of the analogical representations. So it is translated, there's a basic interpretation of the analogical representation, or representations, more likely, into basic meaning units. So the bear is running towards me, and there could be like very simplified notation. You can see in the Parent-Dalgleish how they use this particular type of notation for propositions versus schemas, etc., to indicate a lower level of elaboration versus a higher level of elaboration. In the schemas, you don't really need to worry about that unless you want to. But the idea is that it sort of looks like computer code running parentheses, bear, comma, me, end parentheses. That makes it look very computer, and what is information processing models are all based on the computer model. So that fits in. Now, then this I've also talked about before, that once you have a slew of relevant low-level chunks of meanings represented as propositions, then those get combined into a schematic representation. So a more elaborate thing is that the bear is chasing me and wants to eat me. It's not just before it was the bear is running towards me, but here you've made it personally relevant. Maybe like I said before, maybe it's a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear is chasing me and wants to eat me. I've had to consult my long-term memory to identify what type of bear it is. I've had to personalize it, according to my own view of self, world, and others, as you saw in that diagram of the various domains, goal-relevant domains in Parent-Dalgleish. So you rely on the current propositional representations that have been formed on the basis of your analogical representations, i.e. the bear is running towards me, and then your pre-existing schemas. You have a schema that you've learned that bears are fearsome, man-eating predators. You've learned what a grizzly bear is, essentially the stuff in your long-term memory. And then you combine those elements with each other. And so again, you use those searching and matching strategies. Taking the new information and looking for anything in the long-term store that is similar enough to it. So you do that by searching and matching, and then you associate the new information in the propositions with the old information, which are schemas and probably propositions too, which are part of your pre-existing knowledge structures. And then you come out with a new, highly organized schema to represent what's going on. And I've talked about this before, that a schema is more elaborated and more personally relevant than a proposition, and that this is conveyed in differences in notation. So you can see here in Power and Dog Leash, they do that thing with the parentheses for the proposition, where the verb is on the outside of the parentheses and the subject and object are there in the parentheses, and the schema is there's nothing outside of those brackets. Everything is inside the bracket. Look at that, I've made my brackets wrong, but just ignore that one after the word cancer. So the schema here would be people who smoke cigarettes get lung cancer and die, would be the entire schema. Obviously that relies on a lot of subsidiary propositions. One of them might be that smoking causes cancer. So here is, on this slide, is the idea that a schema, okay, up until now, it's basically been that schemas are organizations of propositional knowledge, both from the new situation and from long-term memory. But now I'm suggesting to you that there could be a role for analogical representations in the generation of schemas. Certainly we've seen that analogical representations are necessary for the generation of propositional representations, but could there be a way in which an analog would be part of a schema? And would that change the way we think about schemas from before? So just something for you to reflect on as you go forward. Now, I've talked about this before, but the appraisal pathway is computational. It seems like it's a serial processing model. It's labor intensive. It is mostly automatic. I've said that it's effortful, and then here I say it's mostly automatic. Most of it is automatized, but it somehow is more burdensome to your processing resources. It involves more complex comparisons than the associative pathway, and centrally it is the comparison of the schematic representation of what's currently happening to other goal relevant schema in your long-term memory. And then more on appraisal, the second slide on appraisal. The present situation is appraised in relationship to your goals, and goals contain particular content. Again, this is representation, right? The representation piece. Knowledge about yourself, knowledge about others, and knowledge about the world, because you have to know what the constraints and the facilitating elements that are available to you might be. And so you have to construct a personally relevant functional context of meaning, a schema, complex system of information, which is composed of propositions and maybe analogs. And then there are, if you like Power and Dog Leash, you can think of there being 5 appraisal scenarios. Again, it's possible to criticize this as being overly simplistic, but they would say that this is what the empirical literature demonstrates. You could appraise the current situation or the target situation, because maybe you're actually imagining a situation or something like that. So I'm going to say we're going to talk about a target situation. You could appraise that target situation as being facilitative of a particular goal that you have. You do that, of course, by comparing your schema about the target situation to your personally relevant, goal-relevant schema and seeing if they match up or not. So you could appraise the target situation as being facilitative of a goal, or and that would yield the emotional experience of happiness. You could appraise it as being indicative of loss or failure in relation to a goal, and that could cause sadness. or appraise the target situation as being a threat to a goal, which would be associated with fear, and or you could appraise the target situation as blocking a goal by a perceived agent. So this is a little different from fear, but when there's somebody, remember that accountability component of the revised version of Lazarus's. It was the 1993 model of primary and secondary appraisal, where secondary appraisal was broken down into 4 components. One of the components was that accountability portion. So that would help differentiate a fear scenario from an anger scenario. If you think that somebody is to blame, then it's possible that you would feel anger rather than fear. But it's hard to feel anger if you don't have someone to blame. Again, you could blame the universe and be mad at the universe. And then there's disgust, which is when you think, I think this is one of the most interesting ones, when the target situation is appraised as contaminating a goal. Something has contaminated your goal. So took a good thing and made it bad, like food that has gone rotten. Food is relevant to the goal of staying alive and staying healthy, fit. And when it's bad, then it has been perverted in some way. Sex is a good thing. But if it is, somehow paraphiliac sort of thing or whatever, then it can be it can have the sense of being contaminated and could generate disgust. Any form of pleasure, when you see somebody who's like, maybe even you recognize yourself if you're being very hedonistic, then the situation that you're in has taken a good thing, which is the experience of pleasure, and made it bad by somehow overdoing it. So you might get disgusted even with yourself, for example, for having been too hedonistic, or with someone else. There's nothing wrong with pleasure per se, but perhaps there's a way in which we've judged an exaggerated, for example, an exaggerated pursuit of pleasure as being disgusting, as contaminating, taking what's good about pleasure and turning the whole experience into something bad. Same thing with vanity, this sort of thing. And then obviously there are cycles of appraisal. That's the thing to keep in mind. There's no real ending. It keeps going. And as events change, life circumstances change, long-term memory changes, then your appraisal keeps changing, but you keep appraising in cycles. And so there are always new interpretations, always new appraisals, and that can change your emotional state, because remember that appraisals generate emotional states, and then you're in an emotional state. Like Damasio would say, that you're in an emotional packet has been activated, and then that activated emotional packet exerts biasing effects. So it's generated by the previous. Basically, there's an emotional state here. I call it the previous emotional state, but in the future, it's going to bias future processing. So if you're in a happy mood, then new things that happen, you're going to appraise it with that happy bias. You're going to tend to see things through rose-colored glasses, etc. And you can think of this, again, as a supervenient biasing effect. That means there's a whole thing that you're experiencing, which is the wholeness of that emotion packet. And then that whole thing has arisen from these component parts, these information processing parts, the appraisal, the generation of the schema, the appraisal that is done based on the schema, and then the action readiness and the physiological response, etc. That's all experienced as a whole thing that has emerged out of parts, but then superveniently it biases future processing. So that these low-level processes, the generation of propositions from analogs, certainly your attentional processes, definitely the organization of propositions and potentially analogs into schemas, that those are all biased by whatever emotion packet is currently in effect. So that's how, incidentally, how emotional states can escalate. You can see how if this goes awry, that would lead to mania, for example, or depressive rumination on the other end. you can play with this idea of supervenient biasing to see how how moods are maintained, or when it gets out of control, that actually moods escalate out of proportion to the situation. Now, that was all route one, the appraisal pathway. So now we have a couple of slides, a few slides on the associative pathway. I'm going to take a drink of water. So sometimes appraisal isn't always occurring in a clear-cut way at the time of the emotion. For example, people who get disgusted by flan, they might get disgusted automatically by the texture of the flan. There are certain people who don't like flan. I love flan, but anyway, so some people get disgusted by flan because of the texture. And the appraisal, which is that that would lead to disgust, would be that this has contaminated my goal of nourishing myself, because it's taken the nourishment and made it bad. Took a good thing and made it bad. That would be the appraisal that would lead to disgust, right? But that's clearly not happening. There's nothing inherently anti-nourishing about flan. Maybe sugary, but that's not so bad. But the fact is that there is a much more automatic, low-level, more primitive type of processing that's happening, whereby that texture is triggering the experience of disgust. So, and this is it's in a more automatic way. So, I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of examples now, but I want to call your attention to page 151 in Power and Dalgleish, where there are two different examples of Peter and Julie. So Peter's fear and Julie's fear. There's no current threat at all. There's the fear of birds, and then the situation with the father, I believe. But anyway, look at those descriptions of fear being generated outside of the appraisal process. And these are things where you could just explain to somebody, if you're somebody's friend, say like, oh, there's nothing to be afraid. These birds have nothing. There's nothing to be afraid of about these birds. But the person wouldn't be able to hear that, because the fear is actually being generated through a more primitive, more automatic pathway. And so look also on page 156 in Power and Dalgleish for three pathways. And remember that for this associative network to generate emotion, it does that through spreading activation. So all of those basic properties of spreading activation that we've talked about at various points throughout the course apply. There are concepts are organized in long-term memory by way of logical links, and meaning is created through the logical links, particularly through their activation. And the links are plastic, so that the more that they get, more frequently they get activated, the stronger they become. Some links are stronger than others, and then their strength depends on how frequently they're activated. And activation spreads throughout the system, following a fanning effect. We heard about Anderson's fanning effect, where it's like ripples in a pond. The activation is strongest when there are fewer. It's like an irrigation system, essentially. So if basically the fewer links there are from one node, the stronger the activation is when it spreads from that node, and the further it gets away, like ripples on a pond, the more it sort of fades out. And remember that spreading activation can happen within a symbolic network or a connectionist network. Here in Power and Dalgleish, we're talking about a symbolic network of nodes, propositions that contain meaning and that are where meaning is localized, even though a connectionist substratum is understood to underlie all mental processes, those ones and zeros. So essentially, this slide is mentioning again what I talked about before, that they're in these associative networks. It's not just propositions; it's propositions and analogs all interacting together, all linked together. And in with the analogs, there are proprioceptive analogs. So that means my image, sense modality image of my shortness of breath, or my sense modality image of my own fast heart rate, or whatever it is. So it's not just what's happening on the outside, but it is also what's happening on the inside. And then how do these automatized generation of emotion, how does this happen? How does this get established? Basically, through repeated pairing of event emotion sequences. So, for example, oh yeah, here's a good one. So say, yeah, you could say something like, okay, so, uh, my father usually slaps me when I smart off. So when your father comes by, you might appraise that situation as at being at risk for getting slapped because maybe you're smarting off all the time. So so you oh no, okay, so sorry, your father, you smart off, and then your father smacks you, and so you've appraised that situation as being afraid of your father smacking you. And so when your father comes by, you learn that essentially your father, the smack hurts, and and there's either fear or anger or both through that appraisal process. But as that situation gets repeated over time, it gets to the point where just the presence of your father is fearful. So, and maybe your father then does therapy later in life and becomes a much more subdued, mellow, loving guy. And still, you find yourself for some time with difficulty letting go of some of those old reflexes of maybe avoiding your father, or flinching when your father comes by, or whatever it is. So this sort of thing would be an example of a repeated event emotion sequence, whether it be fear or anger, um, in this particular case, but actually could be any emotion. So there's a repeated pairing of the event and the emotion, and that after time it becomes automatized. And there are other examples you can think of as well. Um, so, for example, you say you're a person who has panic attacks, and you have had many panic attacks throughout your life, and you know that how they start is with heart palpitations. So you've learned through this event and emotion. So you notice the heart palpitation, and then you experience the panic attack, the extreme fear, and this is repeated over and over again. And so then later on, you take up running, maybe because you heard that exercise is good to lower stress, and that lower stress is associated with lower panic attacks. So as part of your therapy, your therapist recommends that you go running. So you head off running, and sure enough, you start having a fast heart rate, maybe you have heart palpitations or just tachycardic. And because of how many times in the past you have had heart palpitations followed by a panic attack, that fast heart rate from the running then just automatically triggers a panic attack, um, even though you might be appraising the situation as completely benign. In fact, there's nothing scary about it. You're doing something healthy for yourself. So, but the the emotion of fear has already been triggered simply through that associative pathway, that route 2. And you can imagine, you can see how this would be an analogical representation of the tachycardia that would trigger the emotion of fear. It's not logical. It's not part of an appraisal. It's happening automatically and quickly. And in fact, the person might need to stop and calm him or herself down and talk himself down. There's nothing to be afraid of here. My heart is beating because I'm exercising. There's nothing to be afraid of. So, and then in that way, the person could impact the emotional experience. Maybe could be impacted through trying to impact the appraisal, because the route 2 generation of emotion is already going. And then I just wanted to mention that this pairing can happen in an individual's past. Again, referring to Peter and Julie on that page 151, where because of pairings between event and emotion in an individual's past, or maybe in the guy who has the panic attack in the past, or the fear of the father, any of these examples, these are in the individual's past. And due to that repeated pairing of event and emotion, there is an automatizing of the appraisal process, by which later you don't even need to do the appraisal process because it's all automatized. And that's, again, why would this happen? It's to preserve processing resources. It's just similar to practice effects. Things become automatic. We always try to conserve processing resources wherever possible, without even being aware that we're doing it. But it can be in the individual's past, or it can even be in the evolutionary past. There are genetically hardwired predispositions. So this example that I gave of flan, to somebody who loves flan like me, it might seem strange, but there's actually a genetically hardwired predisposition to avoid custardy textures, because custardy textures are reminiscent of rotting food. Actually, when food rots, it deteriorates and gets jelly-like, and and still has been evolutionarily adaptive for organisms to avoid eating rotten food, the food that has a lot of bacteria in it. So there's a hardwired predisposition in many people to avoid custardy textures. Or bitter taste is another one. Most venoms and poisons are bitter. So we have a strong, out of the 4 different, there's sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami or unami, whatever. There's 5 tastes available in our tasting apparatus and gustatory apparatus. And bitter is the taste that is most aversive to most people. I mean, I like sour and I like salty. I like all tastes, but bitter is more aversive to me. Bitter can even be disgusting, to tell you the truth, because a bitter food might be a food that's been poisoned, or a bitter salad might be a salad that somebody accidentally put poison leaves inside, something that wasn't healthy for you. And so evolutionarily, you might have a hardwired predisposition to be disgusted by a bitter taste. Or fear. I'm not quite sure why the text of these slides isn't coming out all the way, but snakes in cages are fearsome to some people, even though they're in the cage, because snakes have been so dangerous over the course of our evolutionary history that as a species, our ancestors, the ones who were able to avoid snakes more effectively, those are the ancestors that tended to survive. So snakes exert a very powerful, genetically hardwired fear response. maybe even spiders also, even when they're inside of glass cages for some people. So that appraisal, which is that the situation isn't dangerous because the snake is in the cage, doesn't even, it's not relevant. I mean, and for some people, you'll see the fear reaction first, followed by the appraisal reaction, which is that in spite of the fact that the snake is dangerous, it's not dangerous now because it's in a cage. You'll see that succession of emotions. But some people will be inconsolable because they won't be able to get past the fact that that's a snake. And there's that hardwired predisposition towards fear. And this can all be thought of as going through the associative pathway to the generation of emotion. So, again, just to recap, Route 1 is the effortful schematic based appraisal. Remember, it's not effortful in the normal sense. It's just more burdensome, more taxing to the information processing system because even when it happens fully outside of conscious awareness, it still is involving higher level organizations, more complex organizations of information than the associative level. But schematic appraisals, you're sometimes aware that you're making them and sometimes you're not. And you might be able to, here's a hint to a previous question, but you might actually go through, therapy, either cognitive therapy or dynamic therapy, expressive dynamic therapy, to look at what are the schemas that that I'm making most relevant and using to guide my reactions to current situations. So now the last little bit of this, we talked about Route 1 and Route 2, talked about basics of emotion, then Route 1, Route 2, and now I'm going to talk about this order to disorder question. It's another really great strength of SPARS is that it ties in the emotional experience and shows that how it's the same processes that underlie ordered experiences of emotion that also underlie disordered experiences of emotion. Now remember that disordered experiences of emotion are not necessarily pathological. Pathological is when it's, it would have to be consistent, it would have to be causing social or occupational dysfunction. It would have to, essentially, we'd have to meet Jerome Wakefield's criterion of harmful dysfunction, which is the central nosological criterion underlying the way the DSM is written, all the DSMs, including DSM-5. So, disordered, though, for example, like you could lose your temper and it could be momentarily maladaptive. But if it's just a one-time thing, then you can't say that the person that there's pathology there where the person has some sort of anger-related mood disorder, like either an irritable bipolar disorder or maybe a personality disorder where there is affective dysregulation with problems with anger, like for example borderline, etc. For those sorts of conditions to be diagnosed, obviously a host of other criteria would need to be met. So disorder is a more primitive, more elemental type of characterization of emotion that is experienced that is not attuned to the current situation and doesn't lead to adaptive behavior. But again, it can just happen one time only. And wouldn't necessarily be considered pathological. So, essentially, these basic features of information processing, particularly within a spreading activation network, this concept of inhibition or facilitation, that these processes are usually adaptive and they lead to helpful experiences of emotion, but they can become rigid, and in the case of rigidity can lead to maladaptive or disordered experiences of emotion. So for example, within a spreading activation network, it's good that one node might facilitate the activation of one node might facilitate the activation of a logically related node, because that helps us understand the world. It helps us organize our interpretation of what's going on, so we can actually understand what's going on. And likewise with inhibition, it's helpful that that a happy moment, a soft caress, helps us inhibit the previously active experience of sadness. That's good. But sometimes inhibition and facilitation become rigid, and that is when they lead emotion to be disordered rather than ordered. So the two main processes here are inhibition and facilitation, and they are general cognitive processes, general information processes. They describe relationships between all manner of cognitive or cognitive affective phenomena, between emotions, where the new happy mood inhibits the old sad mood, or maybe the new fearful appraisal about one thing actually facilitates the fearful appraisal about a different thing that's also going on simultaneously, to result in even an even more intense experience of fear. So facilitation or inhibition between emotions. Also facilitation or inhibition between schemas. One schema gets active, it inhibits the other schema. For example, like a schema for an addict, for example, a schema about getting high and whatever it is, like, so the person might think, if you've ever worked with an addict, maybe there's a schema about if I get high, I feel free. And then there's a competing schema, which is when I stay sober, I have a rewarding life. And so at the moment of relapse, that schema of if I get high, I feel free, it inhibits the other schema, which is if I stay sober, I have a rewarding life. So this could be an inhibitory thing there. And then also inhibition and facilitation between goals. This is actually maybe can also, this same example that I just gave about the addict can also be seen between the goals. Which goal is most important for you? Is it to have a rewarding life, or is it to feel free? And so there might be a trade-off between those goals, and it might just be that they inhibit each other. So one gets active, it inhibits the other one. The other one gets active, maybe because of the presence of a trigger in the environment. See somebody picking up, now you hear that your friend picks up, and so then that triggers you to activate that goal of feeling free. He's feeling free, I want to feel free too. So then that goal gets activated, and it inhibits the other goal of having a rewarding life. So you can see that inhibition and facilitation, they work at all levels. I talked on the other slide, I talked about how nodes, the links between nodes might be either inhibitory or facilitatory. But you can see that they happen between any manner of cognitive psychological phenomena. And you can also see that they can either be adaptive or maladaptive. And so, as with anything in psychology, these processes are adaptive when they're flexible and attuned, and hence they lead to ordered, helpful experiences of emotion that are helpful in decision making, as you've seen in Damasio, etc. And when they are rigid, that's when they're maladaptive and lead to disordered experiences of emotion. That's basically it, and that's basically with anything in psychology. So both of these processes, inhibition and facilitation, rely on a conceptualization of mind as being essentially modular in structure. So when I say modular, I mean composed of modules, like different semi-independent modules all running at the same time, like your iPhone with a whole bunch of different apps running at the same time. The apps might influence each other, but they're also running semi-independently. So the guy who came up with this notion of modularity of mind is Jerry Fodor, a very important mind to know about. And Marcel Kinsborn, whom we touched on briefly, I believe, in Study of Amnesic Memory, also told me once that the mind is at once gloriously integrated and exquisitely differentiated. And it's this idea of semi-independent programs running at the same time, and that they may be competing for salience. So think about when you're looking at Windows or your Mac or whatever, and you have a whole bunch of applications going, but you click on one and you're working within one. So there's one that is active, and that dominates your experience of the system at the time. And it might even dominate the working of the other applications that are also going at the same time, or it might dominate or impact in some way the overall system settings. So I mentioned supervenience before. That's how when something becomes salient, it influences the constituent parts and the rest of the system. So basically, maybe it's like I don't know, some sort of setting on something like recently on my calendar, I changed a setting for time zone support on. You can toggle that on or off. And basically what it is, if you're traveling back and forth between time zones, then one toggle, whether when it's on, it does it one way, and when it's off, it does it another way. But basically it's how does the calendar deal with when you make an appointment for a different time zone and then you switch time zones, and how does the calendar represent that. So it's basically like when the calendar is up and you can toggle on and off, then that actually the settings on that superveniently influence constituent parts of the system. I don't know how helpful that example was, but essentially it's the main thing to keep in mind is that there can be lots of applications running at any given time, and usually there's one or just a couple that are that you're actually working in, and those are the ones that are salient. And you can think of the other programs as competing for salience. And so the idea of modularity, Fodor's modularity, as applied to emotion, would be that emotions act like modules. There could be a fear module, a sadness module, a happiness module, that sort of thing. And so you might have a couple different potential emotional reactions to the same situation, and they might be competing for salience. It's not that they have goals, agendas of their own, each one wanting to be the one to reach salience, but more that they're somehow going to be one that reaches salience, or two maybe. So an emotion becomes salient. It's generated by spars, goes through route 1 or 2, and then superveniently, in a top-down way, biases the function of the cognitive apparatus itself. And for example, a sad mood is generated through the appraisal of a new event, which is that the puppy dog has been lost, and it's indicative of the loss of a goal. Maybe your goal was a happy family life. And then the text that's not seen on this is that that sad mood makes it hard to appreciate new good things that happen. So if there are different modules, then there can be interaction between the modules, and that's where inhibition and facilitation come in. And there are two different types of inhibition. There's passive inhibition and active inhibition. The one with more empirical support is passive inhibition. That's where the strengthening of one module results in its relatively greater influence over the entire system compared to other competing emotion modules. So it's simply just inhibiting the competing modules simply by strengthening the target module. So it gets stronger and stronger. The target module, the one that has reached salience or is reaching salience, gets stronger and stronger, and thereby, because it's getting so much stronger relative to the competing modules, then we can say that there is passive inhibition happening, whereby the strengthened module is passively inhibiting the other modules which haven't been strengthened in the same way. So it's not directly inhibiting. That's why it's not actively inhibiting those. It's just getting stronger itself, and so we can say that it's passively inhibiting the others. Whereas actively inhibiting is more controversial. It hasn't been received a lot of empirical support yet, but that would be like where there's a direct inhibitory effect of one module on other competing modules. That would be like if actually active inhibition is intuitive. That would be like getting happy pushes the sadness out, sort of thing. It makes the sadness weaker, but it just doesn't have a lot of empirical support yet. So that's inhibition, and you can see how inhibition could be adaptive a lot of the time. But you can also see, you can probably think of examples where inhibition between emotion modules could be maladaptive, and you can also see your book for examples of that. So one example of an emotional problem that can come out of inhibition, maladaptive inhibition, would be alexithymia, which is not knowing what emotion you're experiencing. So the dominant module could inhibit your awareness of other competing but nonetheless important emotions. So say actually here's a really good one. You're angry at your lover for cheating on you. And the anger is the dominant emotion. And it has inhibited the potential salience of the sadness that you're feeling underneath. And so where the healing needs to happen is healing that sadness, looking at what came up for you about the this feeling of loss and working with that. And that's where, that's where the person that cheated on you, that's where that person, could make amends, is working with your sadness. If even possible. And that's also where you could learn and grow yourself, is working with your own sadness. The anger is maybe what's most dominant, and depending on how much of an passive inhibitory effect it has had on the sadness, it might impair your awareness of the sadness completely. And all of the important information that an experience of sadness at that moment would convey to you about yourself and your hopes for yourself in your life. So here are a few examples of inhibition. Talked about the first one already, talked about the second one, talked about the third one, a desire competing goals, desire to be socially accepted versus desire to express self. You can see how those would both be nice goals to have. There's nothing pathological about either of them, but you can see how they might inhibit each other. And then also inhibition at the level of the cognitive architecture, which is what I started out talking about, which is the inhibitory connections between nodes. Now, so we talked about inhibition. On the other end, we have facilitation. That's when one type of cognitive phenomenon strengthens other related cognitive phenomena. So it's similar to inhibition because it's the way two modules would relate to each other, but in fact it's the opposite. It's where inhibition is inhibition, facilitation. It's obvious, but basically it can happen in all the same ways that inhibition happens. It can happen at the level of the cognitive architecture between the nodes. It can happen between similar schemas, and it can also happen between emotion modules. And just like inhibition, it invokes that notion of spreading activation and priming. So here, priming, so because facilitation is a type of, in a way, priming, you make it easier for the other module to get activated, or the other node to get activated at whatever level you're talking about the facilitation. So facilitation is absolutely essential for information processing because it's essential for spreading activation to work. Incidentally, so is inhibition. You couldn't have spreading activation or information processing without both inhibition and facilitation. And it leads to problems when it's inappropriate, and that is particularly true in the case of coupling. So coupling is a particular maladaptive type of facilitation where it's a reciprocally facilitative link between two, let's say two, or maybe you could maybe think of an example where where there would be more than two modules, but let's say it's a reciprocally facilitative link between two modules, and it usually results from repetition or trauma. It is characteristically rigid. If it weren't rigid, if it were flexible, it wouldn't be coupling. It wouldn't be maladaptive. So so let's think about two emotions which might be seemingly contradictory, where through repetition of that event emotion pairing, through the process of mental and neural plasticity, long-term potentiation, cause the experience of disordered pairings of emotions. Okay, so there's a couple examples in the book. Have a look at page 166, the examples of Anna and Ed. So Anna, you will see in that little vignette, is sad about things she missed out on because of all her fears. So she's missed out on much of stuff because she was afraid. And then she's sad about those things that she missed out on because of her fear. And that then causes fear about missing out on more in the future, which incites sadness, again, about everything that was lost, or maybe anticipatory sadness about a life where all of those opportunities would be lost. So this is a coupling of sadness and fear that locks her into a very disordered. In this case, it seems, it does seem pathological. It seems that she's going through something. You might be able to specify a diagnosis if you knew more about her. But this is a definitely disordered experience of coupling between sadness and fear. And then Ed, in an even more twisted way, in some way, unfortunately, from Anna, Ed is happy about the things in the past, which incites sadness because they're all in the past, which makes him think more about the past, which was happy, which incites that same sadness again. It catches him in an infinite regress where he's locked in that and he can't really make any real progress. He can't get on. You can see how this would be stasis. He's caught in the past and unable to get out of it, and unable to live his life productively and adaptively now. So both of those cases they're different variants of coupling. But you can see how this coupling is a special variant of facilitation where it's rigid, and it can either involve contradictory emotions, like in the case of Ed, or more similar emotions, like in the case of Anna. But in either case, it's maladaptive because it keeps the person locked in a cycle where they're not reacting to they're not living their life now, essentially. Another example, one that I came up with, was this Schadenfreude, the coupling of Schadenfreude and guilt. Schadenfreude is like a form of contempt, in a way. No, Schadenfreude. Let's see. Schadenfreude is when you are basically happy about. It's basically like a happiness. It's like a perverse sort of delight. It might be as strong as delight. It might be muted, but it's delight that you have at somebody else's expense. So particularly somebody that you like. So you're happy. You're sort of smugly happy when your friend got a lower grade on the test than you, for example. So that's called Schadenfreude. So it's a type of happiness, actually. It's a type of happiness with a particular target. So it's a coupling between happiness and guilt in this example. And and just to note here that contempt, for as we go through this slide, I want you to bear in mind that contempt can be a form of disgust. So, or a pairing of anger and disgust. Contempt is sort of like a pairing of anger and disgust. So first you have contempt for the other. They did worse than you on the test. And then that produces delight in yourself. This is like a classic narcissistic defense. And then this combination produces more disgust or contempt, this time directed against yourself because you notice yourself doing this, and that's not the kind of person that you want to be. So you get contemptuous at yourself, right? And then disgust itself, that obviously this contempt at the self reactivates that disgust module. So you're locked in this disgust thing, and then actually, like, I think actually something even more complex is going on here, because if you are disgusted with yourself, then it means almost that you've divided yourself into two parts. There's the part of you that you're disgusted with, and then there's the other part of you that is noticing how bad that Schadenfreude was, and then feels contemptuous towards that part, and thereby establish itself as superior. So then there's delight. There's this coupling between the delight and the disgust, anger, and it's just an ad infinitum sort of thing where it is you can't get out of it. You might not be able to get out of it unless you either have help, or maybe you have a lot of motivation and desire to introspect and learn and do better. Try to uncouple this Schadenfreude, which is the happiness, and then the guilt slash disgust, sort of like a happiness and disgust coupling is what I would call that. Coupling of happiness and disgust, the case of Schadenfreude. But you can see how this would really keep a person locked in, because you keep getting contemptuous of one thing or another. You're contemptuous of the other person, which makes you happy, which then makes you contemptuous of yourself. But in that, you've split yourself in two, which means that you're not all bad, so that you can sort of identify with the part of you that is contemptuous of the Schadenfreude part of you. And then that makes you happy, but then that causes disgust, causes guilt. It just keeps you locked in. So these examples of coupling, I think, are very interesting, and you can think of any number of examples. They are what make clinical work so tricky. It's so hard to unravel these experiences of emotion, because they're locked in, and they motivate. Each part motivates the other part. It's facilitatory. The particular brand of Schadenfreude-like delight facilitates a disgust module, which facilitates, in a twisted way, a happiness or delight module, which then goes back and facilitates the disgust until something different is done.